First of all, I just want to say one small thing, which is thank you. I want to thank each and every one of you who's here today, who's growing, who's farming, and who's creating and producing our Welsh food today. You are the continuation of this great story. I'm going to be talking a little bit about that story this morning, so thank you so much for everything that you're doing. So, I hope that you'll be able to see my screen now, and I hope you can see the direction of travel for this morning's session, the shape of the session, the topic is why Welsh food history matters. I want to rush through this morning, of course, and to cover a number of things in a short space of time. And in a nutshell, I will be drawing on three headings before we have questions and then before I conclude. So these are the headings: the food landscape, our past. Secondly, a vital question: why is the history of food and farming important? Thirdly, we'll be looking at some specific examples that will illuminate our discussion, I hope, to some extent, before we draw some conclusions and turn to the questions. So, the Welsh food landscape, our past. The food landscape of Wales is nothing like it was in the past. For example, at the beginning of the 20th century, or indeed in any other time. We'll just pause for a second. We have a country of mixed farms with a strong culture of producing cider, curing meats at home, producing butter at home for domestic use in the urban areas, in addition to rural areas. The fishing industry is important along the shores. Wild foods are gathered, and there are various traditions involved with this. In the meantime, we've seen mixed farming disappearing, where growing grain and wheat and so forth used to take place hand in hand with rearing animals. But now we have monoculture in large parts of the country. Another thing that has changed, there's been a drop of some 98% in our orchards in Wales just over the past century. And as a result of this, we've seen the cider completely disappearing from our lives in Wales, a drink that used to be important across a quarter of Welsh land, and it was very much part of some people's salaries. Thirdly, pigs. Pigs were central to the diet of most people in the country and were a vital part of our food, again, in the country and urban areas alike. Pigs could be seen everywhere. They were so characteristically Wales, so that travellers from abroad even noted with surprise how many pigs there were here. Do people today think of pigs as something that is characteristically Welsh? I don't think they do. Fourthly, fish, and really wild foods of all kinds. They would provide food, protein, high quality protein to a number of people, and would afford people an important variety in their diets, not just fish, but cockles, swyn, hedgerow vegetation, and so forth. So that just gives you a picture some 2 centuries ago. So what can we do? What can we make of this? Well, we can summarize this vision by stating that everything was organic, which is an easily forgotten point. Everything was organic, and this was at a time when agriculture was employing well in excess of 10% of the population, and as recently as 1910, this was much lower in Wales than it was in many European countries, and that was due to early industrialization, but there's no time to talk about that today. But it's worth asking the question, is the diet of the poorest people amongst us better or healthier today than it was in 1910? A controversial question, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest that in a number of Wales, the diet of a large proportion of our population is better today than it was even compared to the poorest people in 1910. This should make us think. So, in looking at this question, this, of course, is not a call for us to return to the olden days, but I want us to see and understand that the present situation isn't inevitable. The current situation, or indeed any other age, isn't the model for how agriculture and food in Wales should look. I'm sure you're aware of this, but there is no specific model for us, just human decisions and then lessons that need to be learned. That is the nature of history. And having said this, I want to ask this question. Why is the history of food and agriculture important? There is a tendency in our Western culture to do one of two things, either to discount the past or to glorify it and idolize it. Rather than doing this, here are some more balanced suggestions, if you like. First of all, we should see the past as a resource. The past is a resource to us. Since the past is so full of change, it wasn't one constant entity, and the present is a produce of human decisions in so many ways. There's nothing inevitable about the agricultural system in which we live now. We can draw on the past in its entirety and in its diversity to help us think about our future and to identify unexpected possibilities. We live in an age now where there are concerns about AI, artificial intelligence, destroying jobs on the one hand, but on the other hand, where mental health or ill health is such a blight on our society. Now, if you consider these two things, would it be worthwhile thinking at policy level of ways to encourage many more people to work in agriculture again, as was the case a century ago anyhow? i.e., agriculture can be a solution to an AI problem, a lack of jobs, and also a solution to mental health problems. There's a lot of evidence that working in the open air is beneficial to some people who have some types of mental illnesses. And the past shows us that this solution is feasible, at least it's possible, because we know that far more people in the past had worked on the land. It shows that this is possible. It's important not to discount rather simple insight. Secondly, the past steers our perception of what is normal or what is good. It very much influences it. I'm sure you can hear these voices, or you have heard these voices. You can't do that here. This is a dairy cattle country. This is not a country growing wheat or orchards. And the answer might be, oh yes, since when? 1950, perhaps? So the past very much influences our perception of the present, and the story that we tell is very important as we try and influence people. And as a result of this, our history offers us very important lessons as to the potential of our land and the biophysical barriers, as you'll see on the map here. If people have produced specific things successfully here in the past, be they oats or orchard products or many other things. This demonstrates, of course, it's possible to do this. And I'd like to add, it's possible to do this in a zero carbon manner also. Our forefathers weren't fools in what they were investing in. They didn't grow things that didn't grow, that's simply put. And fourthly, marketing and telling our story. People don't like change. People like tradition. They like to feel safe, especially now in terms of food. So it is one thing to say, oh, I want to produce sheep's cheese on my farm in Meirionnydd. But another thing is to communicate that message. I want to start producing afresh one of the most traditional foods of this part of the world, which is sheep's cheese. And of course, this has a long history in the uplands in Wales. Thirdly, and on this note, I want to give you some specific examples in the light of all of this. These are some things from our food history that might be of great benefit for us to reconsider, some sort of inspiration perhaps. The first example, town and urban gardening. There is a history and historiography that tells us that Wales is solely a rural country. Traditionally, this is not true, and academics over the past decades have done a lot of work to demonstrate that there's a lot of vibrancy in our towns, stretching back to the Middle Ages, and there's a long history of food production, foods of all kinds, in our towns for over the centuries, especially between 1700 and the First World War. You'll see in one of the pictures that I showed you, one of the slides, a potato field in Flintshire around 100 years ago. But I want to talk about the Llandaff area in Cardiff as a wonderful example. The town was full of market gardens that fed a large proportion, well, the largest proportion of the urban communities in South Wales in 1810, so 200 years ago, and even exported some of this produce to Bristol. They didn't just grow potatoes, early cabbage, green leaves, peas, beans, leeks, carrots, salads of different kinds, and some market gardens also produce broccoli, cauliflower, and asparagus, sea kale, and rhubarb. So next time you talk about the history of Welsh food, don't talk about leeks, talk about asparagus. Another example, the most important example, well, they're as important as each other. Exporting quality beef. You've been to Snowdonia. You've seen the numerous stone farmhouses that dot the landscape from the Tudor age. Lovely farmhouses. They testify to the wealth that many farmers made by exporting beef cattle to the very rich market in London. Of course, I'm talking about the drovers. A romantic name, but it wasn't just a lovely, harmless tradition that came from nowhere, but rather, ultimately, a way in which farmers could make money. But what enabled this was the quality of the cattle. People reared cattle in the London area also, but upland farmers in Wales had their advantages on a number of levels. I won't delve into this now, but the quality of the cattle, ultimately the quality of the meat, for various reasons, made this very profitable good for them. So exporting quality food, well, honestly, it's all about exporting quality meet, come on, Meet Promotion Wales. There's a story here for you to tell, and we simply don't tell this story. And thirdly, drinks. In addition to beer, of course, cider, there were other drinks in Wales that survived until the modern drinks, tea and coffee, replaced them some 150 years ago. Two good examples, mead, diod greafol. This was a drink which was made from mountain ash juice. It grew everywhere in the hills. It was popular the length and breadth of the upland parts of the country, from Glamorgan to Gwynedd. It's a strong alcoholic drink, but this drink was so common that overseas visitors to Wales always talked about the fondness of the people of Wales to it. Now it's of course disappeared, but there is a long tradition here. And it would be interesting to revive it. And there are a number of other foods that I could talk about, of course. Traditional types of grain that could cope with our climate. Eating goat meat, oysters, pickled. Baking on a griddle, a very specific way of baking that involves a lot of skill, and not just Welsh cakes. Oat produce of all kinds, lava bread, of course, and many more. Many of these foods have not survived any further than the 1960s. So, conclusions. What conclusions can we draw from all of this? Well, first of all, our yesterday isn't like our today. We've seen very quickly in a number of Wales that food and farming over the years has varied. Remember this if you don't remember anything else. There has been a variety, and this is an important part of our history in Wales, from the food produced to the percentage of the population partook in that activity, to the basic fact that so much food is produced at home for domestic use. Secondly, the past helps us change perspective and to see that the current system is a temporary situation in all ages, and that our food story can be much more far-ranging than solely what the market has called for over the past decades, which in our case is sheep produce and dairy produce. And most importantly, in my opinion, the past offers us various possibilities by giving us an idea as to what is possible in our country. And this is a challenging world. You've already talked about the climate and the other various challenges that we're aware of, that are on their way and that are already here. And food and agriculture can play an important part in responding to those challenges in so many ways, as we've heard throughout the week. As the climate changes, it is possible to argue that it will be possible to produce more in Wales than ever before. And we have to start to think now about this in order for us to make good choices for good reasons, and understanding the past and making this effort to understand the past carefully can really pay dividends as we try and do this. So, if you'd like to learn more, as already mentioned, I have a new book on its way in English, talking about the continuation of our old food traditions, Welsh Food Stories, published by the University of Wales Press. I hope by the end of next year or the beginning of the following year, you can order it in advance. There is a link there on your screens. And I upload articles quite often on my blog. So that is it in a nutshell. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Carwyn. Thank you so much, Carwyn, for that whistle-stop tour of the history of Welsh food, and it's been an inspiration to hear about the sheer variety of foods and the way in which people lived and worked, and it just extends the possibilities, does it not, for the future? Which is so important and so heartening. I want to open the floor now, as it were, to questions and contributions by the audience. You can make your points in the chat function. Some of you have already done so. Just to show your appreciation. Does anyone have a question now immediately? Or just raise your hand or put it in the chat in either Welsh or English.
Was that Angie? Hello? Was it about the diversification, Jane? Yes. Yeah, I'll kick it off anyway. I'm obviously not a Welsh person, so I feel a bit of an intruder. But of course, around the world, food culture and language is intimately related. And you've only got to look at countries like Kazakhstan and places like that that just have incredibly rich diversity of vocabulary related to the foods that they grow and the dishes they create, etc., etc. And my concern, I suppose, is when we lose these foods, we also lose, obviously we are losing part of the culture, and we're losing the language that goes with it. And globalization, whilst there are some benefits to globalization, the one size fits all, which is seeking to make more uniform and regularize our food cultures, is obviously going to lose that, and also to the extent that geographical areas of provenance are being eroded as well. So I don't know, it'd be good to hear other people's views on that. And it's another take on why we need to diversify. Re-diversify, please.
Not yet part of the Welsh language culture is that there is a latent nostalgia within our culture for a lot of these sorts of things that I've been talking about. But it's not, in a sense, it doesn't have a voice at the moment, but it's there in the music, it's there in a lot of the literature, it's there in a lot of people's minds, particularly the older generation still today, who can just about remember it. It's worth saying two other things. One is that we have lost a lot. We've lost an awful lot of Welsh food culture, such as it is. But losing something like that is not a single event that happens. You can unlose something. And the third thing to say is, you mentioned vocabulary and language. There's an enormous wealth of language around food and farming in all these domains in Welsh. That is also being slowly lost at the moment from the language. But I think, again, I don't think there's an inevitability around that. Yeah, exactly. There's a great little tome here, Geirf ar gegin, Ninwel Tibet, around cooking and food preparation vocabulary, a lot of which isn't used anymore in Welsh, but it's there. It's still there in the language.
Diolch, Carwyn. Did somebody have, was I here to start to speak then? Oh, my Robert Idris wedi gofyn.
Robert Idris has asked a question. Robert, would you like to unmute yourself and speak? Thank you, Carwyn. An excellent talk and plenty of food for thought. One of the problems I believe that needs to be solved is the way in which we enable people to access land so that they can produce their own food. or at least the local neighbourhood can produce its own food, and to nurture the skills to do this also, because it appears to me that there needs to be a change of tack on behalf of the current paradigm, which involves moving into agribusiness, and family farms that remain within the business are forced down this path, unfortunately. I think there is a place to have this discussion with the Welsh Government and at a broader level, I'm sure. Thank you. So in terms of the historical perspective on this point, it's worth noting that this has been a long-standing problem in Wales in terms of access to land. I mean, landlords and tenants. They were the bone of contention for a number of centuries, but in this present time, we're in a good position because a high percentage of Welsh land is owned by family farms, much more so than in Scotland and England. This is something we should build on and not see that this will be lost if the land is lost to agribusiness or conifer plantations again. Yes, it's an important point because everything is about to change completely. And there's an opportunity now, and we need to make sure that we take things on the right path now. Has anyone else asked a question on the chat? Judith.
Is it something that could be produced by a small business again? And I don't know if this is Judith. I know this is Judith Thornton, but I know IBAs are looking in at Aberystwyth. They're looking into new food, or innovating new, supporting businesses to produce new foods. They're looking for market opportunities. So, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, and I don't know if there's anyone alive who's tasted it. But in theory, put it this way: if smallholders could produce it regularly across the country in times gone by, then it's hard to imagine that it couldn't be produced again by small businesses. And also, it's also worth saying, it must have been pleasant for it to be produced for so many centuries. Yeah, people didn't eat things or drink things they didn't like back then either.
Yeah. It's going to recite.
Do you have a recipe? No, not quite. There are descriptions. A number of descriptions available. Compiled by travellers to Wales, not detailed descriptions.
Contribution here from Marcus Brown, who is from Germany, I happen to know. Marcus, do you want to unmute yourself and just say a word, because it's nice to have a bit of a European dimension at these times.
Hi, I can unmute myself, but I have to get my video down here as well, because I'm a bit my setup is a bit, IT setup has to change. Hi, yes. So what did you want to talk about, Jane? What was it?
PGI. You were talking about PGIs, I think, weren't you? Well, you didn't quite use the word PGI, but you were looking at the purpose of the EU and the idea of regional food diversity.
It's very interesting to see that the original idea of the EU was peace in Europe. I mean, that is the biggest advantage of the EU that we have had for the last 70 plus years. But the idea was always to have the nations keep their culture and their languages and their characters, because that's what makes the EU such a fantastic place. So you go to Italy and have a different culture, and you go to Wales and have a different culture, you go to Scotland. And the problem is that since the neoliberal age of Thatcher and Reagan, the big businesses have hijacked the union to basically change the rules and regulations to suit them. Yeah, we have a complete economic system that is geared towards big business. I mean, just look at the idea of hygiene and health and safety, and I mean, and raw milk and all those things. It's like there's so much in there that Oh, if you just have to have a new dairy for your local, for your small goat herd or something. I remember a guy in the 90s who wanted to sell his cheese, which was wonderful cheese he made from goat's milk. And he couldn't do that because it would cost him 50 grand to do that. And he said, well, I continue selling to friends and family by word of mouth rather than doing it commercially. And these rules and regulations, they suit the economy of scale business, and we have to come up with a different idea to the economy of scale, I think, so, and that brings it back down to the local level, to the diverse level, and producing the foods that are local to them. I mean, we can't grow avocados or olives in Wales, but we can do other things, so we can import them from local producers or something where they can do it, but without the mafia, as it's currently done in Mexico with the avocados. So, so anyway, yeah. So that's me about EU, and I come from Germany, by the way. Where I come from, our local language has completely been lost. Nobody speaks it anymore. When I grew up in the 80s, 70s and 80s, I had a great aunt who could still speak the language, which was similar to a Dutch, basically. She could converse with the Dutch people, but it's all lost. It's all lost because everything is homogenized. As Angie said, we homogenize things, and that's why I'm so fascinated by the Welsh putting so much effort into this language thing. I'm sorry, I can't speak Welsh yet. If once I move to ABBA, I will start to learn, I promise. Because that is, it's culture, and culture is quality of life. If we all live these individual lives like I'm in London, everybody lives their individual lives. Yes, we speak 300 different languages here in London, but we're not merely a cohesion community. There's little small communities within London, but they bring that community from where they come from. And when that gets lost, then, something's lost, basically.
There's an interesting question implicit in all of that, which is, why have we in Wales lost so much of the food and farming heritage more than many other parts, including Western Europe, when we have not lost so much of the culture? And the answer, I think, is in the question. So much of Welsh energy has gone into and has had to go into simply saying, we're here, we have our own culture, we have a language. And that's not, basically all of the professional Welsh-speaking classes put an enormous amount of energy, free time, campaigning and everything into the very survival of the language and culture. And I think there is a very real sense in which that meant that there was no energy left to defend much of the food heritage. And it's something that with the forces of, all about these forces of neoliberal economics and everything.
Yeah.
So it happened. There is a really interesting question that's come up 3 times in the chat about schools.
All right.
Yeah, carry on. We
go
do need
then.
to finish the session in about 5 minutes.
I'll let you get on with it then.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, we need to, if you want to pick up on, you're going to travel to social and ysgolion.
Yeah. So o ran, hanes bwyd.
In terms of food history taught in schools, as far as I'm aware, there's not much about this in schools. This isn't really covered in schools, just perhaps very little. And I think there would be an interest. I think the door would be open, especially with this new curriculum, where we have cross-cutting themes, as it were, cutting across traditional subjects. But the part of the reason why it's not really talked about in schools is that Welsh food isn't traditionally perceived as being an important part of Welsh culture by the Welsh people themselves. We see literature and music and a number of things being perceived as culture, but we haven't tended to see food as being perceived as a part of our culture. It's not been given the due attention it deserves. But I think there is scope within the culture to change this without this being artificial. Thank you, Carwyn. In our session at, what time is it? 11:45 a session. We'll have a session talking about a project there that introduces the history of farming to school children. I personally work on this, so there'll be a little mention about this at that session, and I think it's very important. We've reached the end of our session. We've extended it until 10 a.m. It's officially closing now. We have to prepare the room for our next session, but people are very welcome just to stay on and speak amongst themselves informally as we prepare. So at 10:15, if you're now, are you there? Do you want to just plug the next session? Well, just an opportunity to say that it'll just elaborate on what Carwyn has already kindly covered for us. There are a couple of questions in the chat here we might have to return to following, well, at the end of that session. So if anyone is interested in the history of Welsh food and its value, in order for us to review our current farming sessions, perhaps we can return to this in that it's a broader system and less carbon intensive system. We could look at farming systems that produce these traditional foods on a broader level in terms of sustainability, and also the economy and the rural community. We need to look at this value, not only in terms of culture and identity and traditions, farming traditions, that give rise to this whole notion of nostalgia, but the way in which they are going to feed our communities in the future in a number of different ways. So please, if you're interested, go and get your tea and coffee and come back at 10:15 to listen to that discussion. And Carwyn will also be joining us and to receive more questions. Thank you. So I'll stay on now here. Stephen will be sorting out the next session, so please stay here. Would anyone else like to contribute? Julia?
We hear some different voices. Julia?
I won't try to say it in Welsh, ond diolch yn fawr, Carwyn, oedd yn ddiddorol iawn.
Thank you,
I really like the connections that were being made between Wales and other cultures in Europe as well, and maybe there are lessons there for us as well, places to build solidarity.
I wonder if Angie would like to come back in again there, because that sort of links to what Angie was saying a bit about income culture and Indigenous culture and how we work together.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. Yeah, I mean, this is a journey that Indigenous cultures are taking all over the world, aren't they? This erosion of their culture, and there are organisations like Via Campesina, which is a worldwide, I think it might be the biggest worldwide movement of what might be called peasant in the positive sense, food growers. We definitely need solidarity, especially as we're now going to approach coming out of Europe formally, but it's not just about Europe, is it? It's about the worldwide movement. And I think there's so much to be shared, and incredibly so much positive that can be shared that needs to be highlighted, particularly in these times. There is an association, an international association for localization, for example, which has got an awful lot of good practice on their website. That's coming out of Local Futures. But we all know lots of other bodies. So I think this is such an important session that we've just had, and I think it's obviously something that we need to explore in a bigger way, because as I put in the chat, it's a holistic approach. It's not just looking at food, it's looking at so many different aspects that intertwine into our lives, because after all, we are a food eating and food producing nation. We all are across the world. We wouldn't be anywhere without it. And so it's not surprising that the threads of our culture are woven together around food and food systems, and the rituals and celebrations that are associated with food. And I think that's really something that we need to both hang on to, unloose, I like that phrase, unloose, celebrate, and move into a new era where we maybe invent our own new ways of celebrating and having rituals around new ways of food production and processing, etc. Thank you.
Something
Thanks,
that
Angie.
occurred to me as a Welsh learner is that there's so much in the Welsh language that is, you know, it is tied up with landscape and the sort of growing practice. And wouldn't that be a brilliant idea for a session at a future conference? I mean, it might be something that actually tantalise new growers coming into Wales to think about learning the language. Another reason for them to learn.
Ma'n ddiddorol. Dwi wedi bod yn
It's
siarad â
interesting.
pobl.
I've been speaking to people who have started a community garden in Llandysul. I know Angie is not here today, but so something that they feel important there is the transferring of skills from the old generation to young people, and also language at the same time. So language will be important. CERED, the organisation promoting the Welsh language in Ceredigion, they've been part of the project because Llandysul is on the border with Ceredigion, and we're keen with the community garden in Aberystwyth to work with CERED and to have Welsh language sessions so that people can learn to garden and learn Welsh at the same time and eat together, because this is also very important in creating a food culture, that we eat the food. Sian has worked, I'm just picking on Sian now, but you've contributed on the chat, in the chat function. Do you have something to say, Sian? Yes, first of all, Carwyn, thank you so much. That was an excellent talk. I really appreciate it. I was just trying to word a question in the chat function, but I haven't figured out the specific words yet. But something along the words of diflanedig, the word diflanedig, lost words. Mairead Hopwood has translated the Robert Macfarlane work, Lost Words, and somebody still trying to learn the Welsh names of birds in Wales from Iolo's books. Are there any lost words from the Welsh food heritage? There is a sense of loss that you have conveyed today. Yes, on a number of levels. On so many levels, yes. I had a discussion with a prominent Welsh poet about this, and there was a feeling, well, the poet didn't really grab this. He didn't really feel that he had an innate interest in this, in the same way as perhaps the vocabulary of wildlife. I think there's something inherent in Welsh culture, Welsh language culture, that is somewhat dubious and suspicious of things that are to do with the history of agriculture and the old Welsh way of life. There's a love-hate relationship, if you like, there. And yeah, I'm sure there's a topic for a PhD there. But it would be nice to see this changing, but we need to win hearts and minds. I think we need to win the hearts and minds of Welsh speakers themselves before we take this further. Yes, I was just reading in Golwg today that Councillor Elwyn Vaughan mentioned the fact that the Green movement, as it is, it's still very much, well, a rather English movement. What is your response to that? Is that something that is true in your experience? Yes, Fiona has just put in the chat function. There's no wish or appetite to remember or celebrate poverty, and I think that's very much part of this, especially there's a strong memory of oppression at so many levels, and this is linked to the way things were in the past. But there are important things that have changed. That means that we don't necessarily have to perceive the past. You know, if you go back to 1900, there are a number of things interconnected. For example, religion in the chapel, an economic system at one level, different things. Collectively, we can take a step back now and select some things. I'll take that, but I won't take those things. But I think we need to make that case within our culture. So I agree, yes.
Diolch yn fawr. Just a really ymwybodol.
Thank you. I'm just aware that our translator's been working for an hour. She has to work for another hour at 15:15. So I will thank you formally. I'll thank you, Carwyn, formally for an inspiring session. You have kick-started a very vibrant and lively discussion. There's much for us to continue to discuss during the day and in the future again. Thank you so much. I'm happy to learn that you are staying on for the rest of the morning.